In the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood, the serene snow-covered streets belied decades of unspoken tension between two neighboring families. On one side of the cul-de-sac stood the Prestons, a white family whose roots in the town ran deep, but whose hearts harbored quiet prejudices, as insidious as they were invisible to their own reflection. On the other side lived the Johnsons, a proud black family who had worked tirelessly to secure their place in the very community where they often felt they didn't belong. It wasn't always this way, at least not for the children. As kids, little Timmy Preston and Marcus Johnson had shared fleeting moments of camaraderie in the cracks of their family's strained relations, innocent snowball fights, or the swapping of comic books beneath the oak tree that split their backyards. But as they grew older, the unspoken lessons from their parents, their schools, and their world shaped them different. Timothy grew into a man with the privileges of ignorance, never questioning why certain jokes his father told at dinner felt so heavy, or why he never considered inviting Marcus to his high school graduation party. Marcus, meanwhile, grew up under the weight of expectation, constantly reminded by his parents to work harder, speak softer, and prove to everyone that he belonged in spaces his white peers entered without thought. The divide widened, though no one could quite pinpoint when the polite waves at the mailbox stopped or when their shared history turned into passing indifference. Time passed, and both families carried on with their lives, more disconnected than ever. That was until one cruel December morning, when the phone rang in the Preston household, shattering the calm. Timothy, now in his 30s and a father himself, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of kidney disease. The words hit like an avalanche: terminal, unless a transplant could be found. The family rallied, launching campaigns across the nation, seeking a compatible donor to save the life of the man who now stood face to face with mortality. Fundraisers, social media drives, and endless prayers filled the days leading up to Christmas, but no match emerged. Meanwhile, Marcus, now a community leader and successful entrepreneur, watched the news from afar. The story of Timothy's desperate search for a kidney donor was plastered on local headlines. It wasn't just a neighbor's plight. It was a chance to confront decades of silence, bitterness, and the chasm of their shared history. Neither man knew that the answer to Timothy's prayers lay just across the street. Marcus Johnson was the one and only perfect match. The first snowfall of December painted the suburban cul-de-sac in a picturesque white, but the festive atmosphere couldn't mask the tension brewing in the Preston household. Timothy's wife, Caroline, juggled the phone in one hand while cradling their infant daughter in the other, trying to explain their situation to yet another hospital administrator. Across the room, Timothy sat slumped in an armchair, staring blankly out the window as holiday decorations began to adorn the neighborhood. The lights and wreaths felt like mocking reminders of a season he might not live to see next year. Caroline, "Just let it go for tonight," Timothy muttered weakly. "We've done everything we can. We'll try again tomorrow." Caroline nodded, but didn't put the phone down. She couldn't. For their daughter's sake, she had to fight harder, even if Timothy had all but resigned himself to his fate. Across the street, Marcus Johnson stood in his own kitchen, watching the snow fall. The faint sound of Christmas carols wafted in from the living room, where his wife, Lisa, was decorating the tree with their teenage sons. Marcus had come a long way since his childhood days of running through the backyard with Timothy. Now a respected figure in the community, Marcus owned a successful real estate firm and was frequently invited to speak at events about overcoming adversity. Yet, even with all his achievements, he could never quite shake the memory of the Prestons' cold indifference or the occasional microaggressions that marked his youth. "Hey, you've been staring out that window for 20 minutes, Lisa teased, coming up behind him. "What's got you so deep in thought?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "You've seen the news, haven't you? Timothy Preston. He's sick. Real bad." Lisa frowned. "I saw the posts online. Kidney failure, right? It's awful." She studied Marcus's face carefully. "Why do I feel like there's more to this?" "I got tested at the blood drive last week," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was anonymous, but I just got a call. I'm a match." Lisa's hands froze mid-motion, the tinsel she had been holding slipping to the floor. "A match? For Timothy? Marcus nodded. Yeah. For him, the room went silent, save for the distant sound of laughter from their sons in the living room. Lisa's brow furrowed, her mind racing. And you're thinking about going through with it? I don't know, Marcus confessed, turning to face her. A part of me feels like it's the right thing to do. But another part of me keeps asking, why should I? After everything, why should I save him? Meanwhile, the Prestons' campaign for a donor continued to intensify. Local businesses donated to their fundraiser, and church groups organized prayer circles. Timothy's father, Richard, even went on a local radio show, pleading for listeners to get tested. But behind the scenes, tensions within the family were boiling over. Maybe we're being punished, Richard grumbled one evening as the family sat around the dinner table. You know, for all this inclusivity nonsense, we've let this country turn into a free-for-all. And now look where we are. Caroline glared at him, her voice sharp. Richard, that's enough. This isn't the time for your politics. Timothy, too weak to argue, simply sighed. Dad, please, can we not do this right now? But Richard wouldn't let it go. I'm just saying, maybe if people stuck with their own kind, things would be different. We wouldn't be in this mess. Caroline stood abruptly, taking her plate to the sink. Unbelievable. Your son is dying, and all you can think about is who's to blame. Maybe if you spent less time preaching and more time actually helping. Her words trailed off, but the tension hung in the air. Timothy closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting back to Marcus. He hadn't spoken to his old neighbor in years, but he couldn't help wondering, had Marcus even heard about his condition? And if he had, would he care enough to do anything about it? Back in the Johnson household, Marcus sat in his office, scrolling through the Prestons' social media campaign. He saw the photos of Timothy as a young father, holding his daughter, smiling despite the obvious toll the illness had taken. He saw the comments from strangers offering prayers and support. And then he saw the post that stopped him cold, a video of Richard Preston on the radio, his words striking like a slap to the face. You know, it's not lost on me that some folks out there don't want to help. Maybe it's because they don't share our values. But I believe God has a plan for us, and that plan doesn't include giving up hope. Marcus shut his laptop with a snap, his emotions a tangled mess. Was this divine irony, a cruel joke, or was it, as Richard had unknowingly implied, part of God's plan? The night was quiet, save for the soft hum of the neighborhood's Christmas lights casting a glow on the freshly fallen snow. Marcus sat alone in his office, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a leaden cloak. On one side of his desk sat a framed photo of his family, a reminder of everything he'd built and the people who depended on him. On the other side was a copy of the donor match letter he'd received, confirming the undeniable truth: he could save Timothy Preston's life. The memories flooded back, unbidden and relentless. He thought about the time years ago when he'd accidentally hit a baseball into the Prestons' yard and Richard had refused to give it back, muttering something about respecting other people's property. He remembered high school when Timothy's friends had openly mocked his African American Heritage Month presentation in class while Timothy stayed silent. And he thought about all the years since, when their two families had lived side by side, as distant as strangers despite their proximity. But then another memory surfaced, one that softened his resolve. Timothy, at 8 years old, standing up to a bully who had called Marcus a racial slur on the playground. Leave him alone, Timothy had shouted, his small frame trembling but determined. That brief flicker of courage had stuck with Marcus all these years, buried beneath layers of resentment and disappointment. Maybe Timothy wasn't his father. Maybe there was still something worth saving. Lisa's voice broke his train of thought. She stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of concern and understanding. You've been in here all night. Have you made a decision? Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Every time I think about helping him, I remember all the times they didn't help us. All the times they looked the other way. How do I forgive that? Lisa stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. This isn't about forgiveness, Marcus. It's about you, about who you want to be. You always say you want to teach the boys to rise above the hate, to lead with compassion. What kind of example would this set for them? Marcus stared at her, her words hitting him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. He stood and peered out the window, his heart skipping a beat when he saw Timothy's wife, Caroline, stepping out into the cold night air. Caroline's knuckles stung from the cold as she knocked on the Johnsons' door, her breath visible in the frosty air. When Marcus opened it, she seemed startled, as though she hadn't fully prepared herself for this moment. "Marcus," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I hope I'm not intruding. I didn't know what else to do." Marcus stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. Lisa joined them in the living room, offering Caroline a seat and a warm cup of tea. "I'm sorry to show up like this," Caroline said, her hands shaking as she held the cup. "But we're out of options. Timothy's getting worse every day, and I know this is a lot to ask, but we're desperate. You're the only match we've found." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're asking me to save the life of a man whose family never saw me as an equal. Why should I do that, Caroline?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she seemed at a loss for words. "Because he's not his father," she finally said. "Because I believe people can change. And because if the situation were reversed, I'd like to think Timothy would do the same for you." Lisa placed a comforting hand on Caroline's shoulder. "You're a strong woman to come here and say that," she said softly. Marcus remained silent, his gaze fixed on the flickering Christmas tree lights. The weight of Caroline's plea settled over him like a heavy snowfall. He knew she was right. Timothy wasn't Richard, and if he let bitterness and anger guide his choice, he'd be no better than the man he resented. Later that night, Marcus sat with his sons, explaining the situation in terms they could understand. "Sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest thing," he told them. "But we don't do it because it's easy. We do it because it's who we are." His youngest son looked up at him, his eyes wide with innocence. "So you're gonna save Mr. Preston?" Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, buddy. I think I am." The next morning, Marcus called the hospital and scheduled the procedure. It wasn't an easy decision, but as he hung up the phone, a sense of peace washed over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was bridging a gap that had divided their families for far too long. The days leading up to the surgery were filled with an uneasy mix of anticipation and reflection. For Marcus, the decision to donate his kidney wasn't just about saving a life. It was about confronting the history he shared with Timothy. It was about choosing compassion over bitterness, even when the weight of past injustices made it feel impossible. Word of Marcus's decision spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon the story was picked up by local news outlets. Headlines like "Neighbor Steps In to Save Dying Man's Life" painted Marcus as a hero, but the coverage also dredged up decades of unspoken tension. Social media buzzed with comments both praising Marcus for his generosity and questioning why he would help someone whose family had treated him as less than equal. The Johnsons' front yard became a flurry of reporters and camera crews, all eager to capture the story of a black man saving his white neighbor. Marcus hated the attention. He hadn't made this decision for glory or recognition, and the narrative being spun felt hollow, even exploitative. At the same time, the news brought an unexpected reaction from Richard Preston. One evening, he showed up unannounced at Marcus's front door. Marcus opened the door, surprised to see Timothy's father standing there, clutching a bottle of whiskey and looking uncharacteristically subdued. Richard cleared his throat, avoiding Marcus's gaze. I just wanted to come by," Richard began, his voice unsteady. "I heard what you're doing for Tim, and, well, I wanted to say thank you." Marcus crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You don't owe me any thanks, Mr. Preston. I'm not doing this for you." Richard flinched at the bluntness of Marcus's words, but nodded. "I know, but still, it means a lot. You're a better man than me, that's for sure." For a moment, Marcus was tempted to lash out, to remind Richard of every slight, every hurtful word. But instead, he simply said, "You're right about that." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Richard nodded again, his face lined with something that resembled shame. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. At the Preston household, Timothy was grappling with his own emotions. The news of Marcus's decision had left him overwhelmed, not just with gratitude, but also with guilt. He couldn't shake the memories of how he had distanced himself from Marcus over the years, staying silent when his friends or even his father made racist remarks. One evening, as he lay in bed, Timothy turned to Caroline. "Why is he doing this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "After everything, why would he save me?" Caroline took his hand, her expression soft. "Maybe he sees something in you that you've forgotten is there," she said gently. "Or maybe he's just a better person than the rest of us." Timothy's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve this. I've done nothing to earn it. That's the thing about grace," Caroline replied. "It's not about deserving it. It's about someone choosing to give it anyway." As the day of the surgery approached, Marcus underwent a series of preoperative tests. Everything seemed to be on track until one routine scan revealed an unexpected issue, a small abnormality in Marcus's remaining kidney. The doctor called Marcus into his office to discuss the findings. "Mr. Johnson," the doctor began, his tone serious, "we've discovered something we didn't anticipate. It's not a deal breaker for the surgery, but it does pose a risk. If we proceed, there's a small chance your remaining kidney may not function as efficiently as we'd like." Marcus frowned. "What kind of risk are we talking about?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "It's not life-threatening, but there's a possibility you could experience complications down the line. We'd need to monitor you closely for the rest of your life." Lisa was furious when she heard the news. "You're telling me he could risk his own health to save someone who probably wouldn't even cross the street to help him?" She snapped. "It's not that simple," Marcus said calmly. "This isn't about Timothy. It's about me and the kind of person I want to be." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "And what about the kind of person you are to us? To your family? Do we not matter as much as this choice you're making?" Marcus pulled her into a hug, his voice steady. "You matter more than anything, but this is something I have to do. Not for them, for me." The stage is set as the day of the surgery drew closer. Tensions ran high. Timothy wrestled with guilt and gratitude, struggling to reconcile his past with the incredible gift Marcus was about to give him. Marcus, meanwhile, prepared himself for the risks ahead, knowing that his choice would forever change not just his life, but the lives of everyone involved. Unbeknownst to both men, the surgery would be just the beginning of a journey that would test their faith, challenge their perspectives, and force them to confront the truths they had long ignored. The news of Marcus's potential health risks rippled through the Johnson household like a shockwave. Lisa, typically a calm and composed presence, found herself snapping at the smallest things, her worry manifesting as anger. Their sons, old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, grew quiet and withdrawn, watching their parents with wide, uncertain eyes. Late one night, Marcus sat with Lisa in the living room, the glow of the Christmas tree casting soft shadows across their faces. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken fears. "Have you thought about the future?" Lisa asked, breaking the quiet. Her voice was calm now, but her eyes betrayed the storm of emotions inside her. "If something happens to you because of this," she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "I have," Marcus replied, his tone steady. "I've thought about it a lot, but I keep coming back to the same thing. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do this. I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved him." Lisa wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice trembling. "But what about us? What if this changes everything for us?" Marcus reached for her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together. We've always faced things together." Lisa nodded, her expression softening. She didn't fully agree, but she understood. Marcus had always been guided by his principles, and she knew there was no changing his mind. At the Preston household, the atmosphere was just as tense, but for entirely different reasons. Timothy's parents, Richard and Eleanor, had always prided themselves on being good Christians, but Marcus's decision to save their son forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth. Their actions hadn't always reflected their faith. I don't understand why he's doing this, Richard muttered one evening as the family sat around the dining table. His tone was defensive, almost angry. After all these years, after everything we've said and done, that's exactly why, Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharp. Don't you see? He's better than we ever were. Better than you, Richard. And maybe it's time we learned something from him. Timothy, sitting quietly at the table, finally spoke. I've spent my whole life trying not to think about how we treated them. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that I wasn't like you. But the truth is, I didn't do anything to make it better. I just stood by and let it happen. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his face hardening. What's done is done. The important thing is that you're getting a second chance. But do I deserve it? Timothy asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Do I really deserve it? Eleanor reached across the table, placing a hand on her son's. It doesn't matter whether you think you deserve it. What matters is what you do with it. Don't waste this gift, Timothy. Don't let it be in vain. Outside the two households, the neighborhood and the larger community were buzzing with debate. The story had become a lightning rod for discussions about race, forgiveness, and humanity. Some saw Marcus as a hero, an example of grace and compassion in a divided world. Others questioned his decision, arguing that it was too much to ask of anyone, especially given the history between their families. At a local coffee shop, a group of neighbors gathered to discuss the situation. I think what Marcus is doing is incredible, one woman said. It's the true spirit of Christmas, helping someone in need, no matter the cost, but at what cost to him? Another countered. It's easy to call him a hero, but he's risking his own health for someone who never even treated him like an equal. The debates echoed online, where the story had gone viral. Marcus avoided reading the comments, but his sons couldn't resist. They were both proud and protective of their father, but the vitriol they saw from some corners of the internet left them shaken. Dad, his eldest son said one evening, do you think people will ever really understand why you're doing this? Marcus smiled faintly, ruffling his son's hair. Probably not, buddy. But that's okay. It's not about what they think. It's about what I know is right. 2 days before the surgery, Timothy worked up the courage to visit Marcus. It was the first time they'd spoken face to face in years. When Marcus opened the door, Timothy stood there, looking thinner and more fragile than Marcus remembered. Can we talk? Timothy asked hesitantly. Marcus nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat in the living room, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. I don't know how to say this, Timothy began, his voice shaky. But thank you. I know I don't deserve this, your kindness, your sacrifice. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to make it up to you. Marcus studied him for a long moment before speaking. You're right. You don't deserve it. But that's not why I'm doing it. Timothy looked down, shame coloring his face. Why are you doing it then? Because I can, Marcus replied simply. Because I believe in being better than the hate we've been handed. And because I'd rather save a life than carry the weight of bitterness for the rest of mine. Timothy nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'll never forget this, Marcus. I promise. The night before the operation, both families gathered in their respective homes, praying for the strength to face what lay ahead. For the first time in decades, the fences that had divided their lives seemed a little less insurmountable. But no one could predict how the events of the next day would test their resolve in ways they hadn't yet imagined. The morning of the surgery dawned cold and clear, the hospital illuminated by the soft glow of Christmas lights strung along its facade. Inside, the air was thick with a mixture of hope, anxiety, and the quiet hum of bustling activity. Both families had gathered in separate waiting rooms, their lives about to intertwine in a way that no one could have anticipated. Marcus's family sat together, their faces drawn with worry. Lisa held his hand tightly, her normally steady composure visibly shaken. The boys sat close to their mother, trying to mask their unease with distracted scrolling on their phones. Meanwhile, Timothy's family waited nearby, his wife Caroline pacing nervously while Eleanor sat quietly, her hands clasped in prayer. Richard stood apart, staring out the window with a pensive expression that hinted at an internal struggle. When Marcus walked in, accompanied by a nurse, the room fell silent. His calm, steady demeanor was a stark contrast to the tension around him. Richard turned to him, his face tight with discomfort. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice gruff. "I just want to say." Marcus cut him off, raising a hand. "Save it, Richard. I'm not doing this for your gratitude. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Let's leave it at that." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He nodded stiffly and stepped back, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Eleanor, however, approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "You are an extraordinary man, Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for giving our son a chance." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "I hope he makes the most of it." Unbeknownst to the families inside, the hospital had become a focal point for reporters and onlookers, eager to capture the unfolding drama. News vans lined the street, and journalists jostled for interviews with anyone who might offer a new angle on the story. The attention wasn't welcome. Caroline, frazzled by the media presence, had to fend off questions about how she felt about Marcus's decision and whether she thought it would heal racial tensions between the families. "I don't care about the bigger picture right now," she told one reporter sharply. "I just care about my husband surviving this." Back inside, hospital staff worked to shield the families from the media circus, but the tension outside was impossible to ignore. As Marcus was prepped for surgery, the attending physician approached him with a concerned look. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her tone measured but serious, "we've reviewed your latest test results again. That abnormality in your remaining kidney, it's more pronounced than we initially thought. The risk is still low, but it's higher than we originally estimated." Lisa, who had insisted on being present during the briefing, paled. "How much higher?" she demanded. The doctor hesitated. "We're looking at a 15-20 chance of long-term complications. It's not insignificant, but it's still manageable." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand the risks. Let's proceed." Lisa grabbed his hand, her voice breaking. "Marcus, please. You've done enough. No one would blame you if you backed out." Marcus looked at her, his gaze steady. "I'd blame myself," he said quietly. "I have to do this, Lisa." Lisa didn't argue further, but the tears streaming down her face spoke volumes. In his own pre-op room, Timothy lay on a hospital bed, hooked up to a tangle of wires and monitors. Caroline sat by his side, holding his hand tightly. The usually stoic Timothy was visibly emotional, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I don't deserve this, Caroline," he said, his eyes glistening with tears. "How do I make peace with the fact that the man saving my life is someone I ignored, someone I let my family disrespect for years?" Caroline squeezed his hand. "You don't make peace with it. You honor it. You use this second chance to do better, to be better. That's the only way to repay him." Timothy nodded, but the weight of his guilt was palpable. As the surgeons worked to extract Marcus's kidney, the tension in the waiting rooms reached a fever pitch. Both families sat in silence, the occasional whispered prayer or muffled sob breaking the quiet. Lisa, unable to sit still, paced the length of the room, her hands clasped tightly together. Caroline watched her for a moment before standing and approaching cautiously. "Lisa," she said softly. Lisa stopped pacing, turning to face her. "What?" "I just wanted to say, I know this isn't easy for you," Caroline said, her voice gentle. "But I hope you know how much this means to us. To me, to our daughter, to Timothy. I'll never forget what Marcus is doing." Lisa nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Just make sure Timothy doesn't forget it either." Hours later, the surgeries were complete. Timothy's new kidney was functioning as expected, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery. But as Marcus was wheeled out of the operating room, a sudden complication arose. The heart monitor beeped erratically, and the nurses sprang into action. "We've got irregular rhythms," one of them called out. Lisa, who had been waiting anxiously in the hallway, saw the flurry of activity around Marcus and immediately panicked. "What's happening? What's wrong?" she demanded, trying to push past the nurses. "Mrs. Johnson, please step back," a nurse said firmly, blocking her path. Lisa's world seemed to tilt as she watched the medical team work frantically to stabilize Marcus. In the Preston waiting room, Caroline received the news that Timothy's surgery had gone well. Relief flooded her face, and she turned to Eleanor with tears of joy. But their celebration was cut short when Richard entered the room, his expression grim. "They're saying something's wrong with Marcus," he said, his voice low. Caroline's heart sank. "What do you mean? What's wrong?" "I don't know," Richard admitted, "but I think we need to pray." As the two families waited anxiously for updates, the air was heavy with uncertainty. The surgery was supposed to bring salvation, but now it seemed to have opened the door to an even greater challenge. The night stretched on as both families waited for news. The hospital staff worked tirelessly, moving between operating rooms and recovery areas. For hours, it felt as if time itself had stopped, holding everyone in a state of suspended tension. Lisa sat in a hard plastic chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her sons, seated on either side of her, clung to her arms, their usually confident faces streaked with tears. A nurse approached cautiously, her expression neutral but professional. "Mrs. Johnson," she began, "your husband has experienced complications related to blood pressure regulation. His body went into temporary shock during recovery, but the situation is stabilizing. We're monitoring him closely, and he's responding well to treatment. He's not out of the woods yet, but things are looking better." Lisa exhaled sharply, tears streaming down her face as she pulled her boys into a tight hug. Relief was mixed with lingering fear. "Can I see him?" she asked. "Not just yet," the nurse replied gently. "We need to make sure he's fully stable, but I'll let you know as soon as you can." Lisa nodded, her relief tempered by the weight of uncertainty. Across the hall, Timothy was awake and lucid, but the news of Marcus's complications hit him like a punch to the gut. Caroline sat beside him, holding his hand as he struggled to process his emotions. "This isn't fair," Timothy said, his voice cracking. "He risks his life to save me, and now he's the one who might not make it. How do I live with that?" Caroline squeezed his hand. "You don't let it weigh you down, Tim. You let it drive you to be better, to make this worth it. That's the only way to honor what he's done." Timothy shook his head, tears spilling onto his pillow. "I should have been the one to take the risk, not him. I've done nothing to deserve this chance. You deserve it because he believes you do," Caroline said firmly. "Now it's time for you to believe it too." While Caroline comforted Timothy, Richard wandered the hospital corridors, his mind awash with memories of his past behavior. He saw Marcus's face in every memory, the countless times he had dismissed, overlooked, or outright disrespected the man who was now fighting for his life. He found himself in the hospital chapel, the soft glow of candles illuminating the quiet space. Kneeling before the altar, he clasped his hands together, something he hadn't done sincerely in years. "God," he began, his voice trembling, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I sure as hell don't deserve Marcus's. But if you can find it in your heart to save him, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the man I should have been all along." Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "Please, just let him be okay." Hours later, as the Johnsons and Prestons waited in adjoining rooms, the hospital staff brought in updates. Marcus was showing signs of improvement, though the next 24 hours would be critical. The cautious optimism was enough to spark a sense of fragile hope. Caroline approached Lisa, who was seated with her sons, and hesitated before speaking. "Lisa, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for standing by Marcus, for supporting him through this. I know how hard this must be for you." Lisa looked up, her exhaustion evident, but she managed a faint smile. "Thank you for saying that. I just want him to come home to us." Caroline nodded, her eyes glistening. "We've been so focused on Timothy, but we're praying for Marcus too. I hope you know that." For the first time, the two women shared a moment of connection, a small but significant step toward healing the rift between their families. The next morning, Marcus stirred in his hospital bed, his eyelids heavy and his body weak. Lisa was at his side immediately, tears streaming down her face as she held his hand. "Hey," Marcus murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you hey me," Lisa said, laughing through her tears. "You scared me half to death." Marcus smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. "I'm sorry, but I'm here. You're here. Lisa echoed, leaning down to kiss his forehead. And you'd better stay here, because we've got a lot more life to live. Marcus Johnson. Later that day, Timothy, still weak but mobile, insisted on visiting Marcus. With Caroline's help, he shuffled into Marcus's room, his eyes filled with emotion. Marcus opened his eyes and managed a small smile. "You look terrible," he joked weakly. Timothy chuckled, his voice breaking. "Look who's talking." He grew serious, his eyes welling with tears. "Marcus, I don't even know where to begin." "Thank you doesn't feel like enough." Marcus waved a hand dismissively. "Don't make it weird, Tim. Just take care of that kidney, all right?" "I will," Timothy promised. He hesitated before adding, "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you for this." Marcus looked at him, his expression soft but firm. "You don't owe me anything. Just do better. Be better. That's all I ask." Timothy nodded, his heart heavy with both gratitude and determination. "I will. I promise." As news of Marcus's recovery spread, the community's response was overwhelming. Neighbors organized a meal train for both families, sending food, cards, and messages of support. Even Richard, in an uncharacteristic gesture, publicly thanked Marcus during a local church service, describing him as an example of grace and courage. His words marked a turning point, sparking conversations about forgiveness and reconciliation throughout the neighborhood. Though the surgeries were over, the real journey was just beginning. Marcus's recovery would be long and uncertain, and Timothy would face ongoing challenges as his body adjusted to the transplant. But both men and their families had taken the first steps toward healing, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. The days following the surgeries brought cautious optimism. Marcus's condition stabilized, and he was moved to a recovery room, though the doctors warned that he would need months of careful monitoring. Timothy was regaining his strength, and his body seemed to be accepting the kidney well. Yet, the emotional undercurrents that had carried both families to this point were far from resolved. On the second night after Marcus was moved to recovery, Lisa found an envelope slipped under the door of his hospital room. The handwriting was neat, but unfamiliar. Curious, she opened it to find a short note. "You saved one life. Now save the rest." Look beyond the surface. Confused and slightly unnerved, Lisa showed the note to Marcus, who frowned as he read it. "What does that even mean?" Marcus asked, his voice still weak. Lisa shrugged. "I don't know, but it doesn't sit right with me." "Do you think it's about Timothy? Or maybe someone in the community?" "Maybe," Marcus murmured, though his mind was already spinning with possibilities. Lisa slipped the note into her purse, deciding to keep it quiet for now. But the cryptic message lingered in her thoughts, adding an edge of mystery to an already complex situation. As the community rallied around the Johnsons and Prestons, some members suggested holding a neighborhood meeting to discuss the broader implications of the situation. The idea was to use the story as a catalyst for healing and dialogue about race, privilege, and accountability. Marcus, still recovering, couldn't attend, but Lisa and Caroline agreed to represent their families. The meeting, held in the local community center, quickly turned contentious. "I think what Marcus did is incredible," one neighbor said, "but let's not pretend it's normal. It's not every day someone puts aside decades of mistreatment to save another person's life, but isn't that the point?" Another countered. "Marcus showed us what forgiveness and grace look like. Maybe it's time we all take a hard look at how we treat each other." Not everyone agreed. Richard Preston, who had reluctantly joined the meeting at Eleanor's insistence, bristled at the implication that his family bore responsibility for the racial tensions in the neighborhood. "My son almost died," he said defensively. "Are we really here to blame us for everything wrong in this community?" Lisa, sitting a few rows back, couldn't stay silent. "Your son almost died, but Marcus saved him. And Marcus wouldn't have had to if this community didn't turn a blind eye to the things people like you say and do every day." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Richard's face turned red, but he didn't respond. Caroline, sitting next to him, looked down at her hands, shame etched into her features. While the community wrestled with its collective conscience, Timothy found himself increasingly introspective. The physical recovery was hard enough, but the emotional toll of everything that had happened weighed heavily on him. One afternoon, as he flipped through a stack of letters from well-wishers, he came across a note from an anonymous sender. You are given a second chance. Don't waste it. Your actions can create ripples. Timothy stared at the note, feeling both inspired and overwhelmed. He realized that the time for passive gratitude had passed. If he wanted to honor Marcus's sacrifice, he needed to do more than just say, thank you. He needed to act. As Timothy began exploring ways to make a difference, he discovered that the hospital where he'd received his transplant had been struggling to maintain adequate funding for organ donation outreach programs. Many patients on the waiting list didn't have access to the resources or networks that had ultimately connected him to Marcus. This could be my way to give back, Timothy told Caroline one evening. I can use my story to raise awareness and help others who might not be as lucky as I was. Caroline nodded, pride evident in her eyes. That sounds amazing, Tim. And I know Marcus would support you in this. Back at the Preston household, Richard was wrestling with a secret he'd kept for years. In a moment of reflection, he pulled out an old journal and flipped to a yellowed page. Scrawled in his younger handwriting were notes from a meeting he'd attended decades ago, one that had set the tone for how he'd treated the Johnsons. The journal entry revealed that Richard had been part of a local group that worked to subtly suppress property values in Black-owned neighborhoods, ensuring that families like the Johnsons couldn't thrive. Though he'd never acted overtly against the Johnsons, his complicity in the system had haunted him ever since. Eleanor found him in his study, the journal open in front of him. What's that? She asked, her voice cautious. Richard hesitated before handing her the journal. It's the truth, he said, and I think it's time I stopped hiding from it. Eleanor read the entry, her face a mixture of shock and sadness. Richard, this is bigger than just us. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, Richard admitted, but I think I need to start by telling Marcus. As Christmas approached, both families were invited to a special church service dedicated to reconciliation and healing. Marcus, now strong enough to attend, was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed, encouraged by Lisa and his sons. The service was emotional, filled with heartfelt prayers, hymns, and moments of reflection. During the service, Richard stood up unexpectedly and asked to speak. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, he began, his voice unsteady, and I've been part of things I'm not proud of. But today, I want to start making amends. Richard turned to Marcus, who was seated near the front. Marcus, I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I don't expect it, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. The congregation held its breath as Marcus stood slowly, his face unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Thank you, he said simply. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. The weeks following the surgeries brought both families closer, but healing was not without its challenges. As the holiday season passed, the Prestons and Johnsons found themselves navigating a new normal, one shaped by the weight of the past and the promise of a more hopeful future. Richard's public apology at the church service was just the beginning. When the congregation learned of his involvement in discriminatory housing practices, reactions were swift and varied. Some neighbors applauded his honesty, viewing his confession as a brave first step toward reconciliation. Others, particularly those who had been directly affected by systemic racism in the community, were less forgiving. For Marcus, Richard's admission stirred a storm of emotions. He appreciated the apology but struggled to reconcile it with the years of subtle and overt prejudice he'd endured. One evening, Richard came to visit Marcus at home. Standing awkwardly in the doorway, he clutched the journal that had been the catalyst for his confession. I brought this, Richard said, handing it to Marcus. It's everything. Notes from meetings, letters, decisions I was part of. I thought you should have it. Marcus stared at the journal for a long moment before accepting it. Why now, Richard? Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping. Because it's the least I can do. I can't undo what's been done, but I can stop pretending it didn't happen. Marcus nodded, tucking the journal under his arm. It's a start, he said, though his tone remained guarded. Meanwhile, Timothy threw himself into his new mission with a fervor that surprised even himself. Partnering with the hospital's outreach team, he began sharing his story at local events, highlighting the importance of organ donation and the disparities that left so many without access to life-saving care. At one event, he stood before a packed auditorium, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Marcus Johnson," Timothy said. "His sacrifice saved my life. But this isn't just about me. It's about the thousands of people still waiting for a second chance. We need to do better as a community, as a country, as human beings." The audience erupted in applause, and Timothy felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was his purpose, the way he could honor Marcus's gift. Despite Timothy's efforts, the story of the Johnsons and Prestons continued to polarize the neighborhood. While some saw the situation as a chance for growth and unity, others resisted the changes it brought. A small but vocal group began circulating anonymous flyers, accusing the Johnsons of using the situation to push a political agenda. The insinuation stung, especially for Marcus, who had avoided the spotlight as much as possible. Lisa found one of the flyers in their mailbox and brought it inside, furious. "Can you believe this?" she said, slamming it on the kitchen counter. "After everything you've done, they still find a way to make you the villain." Marcus read the flyer silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, he shook his head. "It doesn't matter," he said. "Let them talk. We know the truth." But the truth wasn't enough for Lisa. That night, she wrote an op-ed for the local newspaper, calling out the cowardice of those hiding behind anonymous accusations and reminding the community of the sacrifices Marcus had made. The piece went viral, sparking a heated debate, but also rallying support for the Johnsons. As tensions simmered, Caroline decided to take matters into her own hands. She approached Lisa with an idea to host a neighborhood event, a barbecue in the park, to bring people together and foster dialogue. "I know it's a long shot," Caroline admitted, "but I think we need to try. If we don't, this division is only going to get worse." Lisa was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. "Okay," she said, "but only if we make it clear that this is about action, not just words." The barbecue, held on a sunny spring afternoon, was a tentative success. Dozens of families attended, including many who had remained silent during the fallout of Richard's confession. One of the most poignant moments came when Marcus and Timothy stood together to address the crowd. "This isn't just about what happened to us," Marcus said. "It's about what we do next. We can't change the past, but we can decide how we move forward as neighbors, as friends, as a community." Timothy added, "And that starts with listening. Listening to the stories we've ignored, the pain we've dismissed, and the voices we've silenced. It's not going to be easy, but it's necessary." The crowd responded with a standing ovation, and for the first time in months, hope seemed to outweigh tension. After the barbecue, Richard began volunteering at a local organization that worked to combat housing discrimination. It was a humbling experience for him, but also transformative. One day, while working on a case involving a family fighting an unjust eviction, Richard realized how much he had contributed to the systemic injustices he was now trying to dismantle. "I can't undo the harm I've caused," he told Eleanor that evening, "but I can make sure I don't add to it. And maybe, just maybe, I can help fix it." Eleanor smiled, her pride evident. "It's never too late to change, Richard. I'm just glad you finally found your way." As the months passed, both families began to find a fragile sense of peace. The Prestons and Johnsons started to interact more frequently, not as rivals or even as reluctant allies, but as people learning to trust and understand one another. For Marcus and Timothy, the bond forged through the transplant became a foundation for something deeper, a genuine friendship. "Who would have thought?" Timothy said one day as they sat together on Marcus's porch, watching their kids play in the yard, "that it'd take something like this to bring us together." Marcus chuckled. "Life's funny that way, but I'll take it." Though the neighborhood began to show signs of unity, underlying tensions persisted, threatening to unravel the fragile progress that had been made. Both families faced challenges from within and outside their homes, forcing them to confront their deepest fears and most entrenched beliefs. Marcus had been recovering well, but 6 months after the transplant, a routine checkup revealed troubling news. His remaining kidney was underperforming, possibly a delayed complication from the surgery. The doctor recommended immediate adjustments to his diet, medications, and lifestyle. Lisa was devastated by the news, though she tried to mask her fear in front of Marcus. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, she finally let her emotions spill over. "I told you this would happen," she said, her voice shaking. "You gave everything to save Timothy, and now we might lose you." Marcus reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "We're not there yet, Lisa. And even if it comes to that, I won't regret my choice. I couldn't have lived with myself if I hadn't done it." Lisa wiped her eyes angrily. "You're always so calm, so sure of yourself." "But I'm terrified, Marcus. I don't want to raise our boys without you." "You won't have to," Marcus said softly. "I'm not going anywhere. Not if I can help it." Despite his reassurances, the fear lingered, casting a shadow over their lives. Timothy, too, was grappling with his own challenges. His work with the hospital's outreach program had gained significant traction, but it also attracted criticism. Online trolls accused him of exploiting Marcus's story for personal gain, while others dismissed his efforts as performative. The backlash hit Timothy hard. One evening, he broke down in front of Caroline. "No matter what I do, it's never enough," he said, his voice choked with frustration. "I'm trying to make a difference, but all people see is the guy who had to be saved." Caroline knelt beside him, her expression firm. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, Tim. What you're doing is important. Focus on the lives you're helping, not the people who want to tear you down." Her words gave him strength, but the weight of public scrutiny continued to gnaw at him. To build on the success of the first event, Lisa and Caroline organized another neighborhood gathering, a summer picnic meant to foster deeper dialogue. But tensions bubbled to the surface when a heated debate broke out between two neighbors. One, an older man who had lived in the community for decades, argued that the focus on racial reconciliation was unnecessary. "We've all lived here just fine for years," he said. "Why stir up trouble now?" Another, a younger woman who had recently moved into the area, pushed back. "That's easy for you to say. You've never had to deal with the kind of discrimination others here have faced. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away." The argument quickly escalated, drawing others into the fray. Marcus, who had been quietly observing, finally stepped forward. "Enough," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't about pointing fingers or keeping score. It's about taking responsibility for ourselves, for each other, and for the future we want to build. If we can't do that, we might as well pack it in now." The crowd fell silent, chastened by his words. But the incident underscored just how far the community still had to go. Richard's efforts to make amends continued, but not everyone was ready to forgive him. One day, while volunteering at the housing organization, he encountered a man who had been directly affected by his past actions. "You've got some nerve showing your face here," the man said coldly. "Do you think a few good deeds can erase the harm you've done?" Richard looked him in the eye, his expression pained but resolute. "No, I don't, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to do better now," the man scoffed, shaking his head. "It's not enough." Richard nodded. "Maybe it's not, but it's all I have." The encounter left Richard shaken, but more determined than ever to prove that his change of heart was genuine. One evening, Timothy visited Marcus at his home, carrying a stack of papers. "What's this?" Marcus asked as Timothy handed him the bundle. "It's everything I've been working on," Timothy said. "The outreach program, the speaking engagements, the fundraising initiative. None of it would have been possible without you." Marcus flipped through the papers, his expression thoughtful. "You've done good work, Tim. I'm proud of you." Timothy hesitated, then said, "But it's not enough, is it? No matter how much I do, I can't undo the past." Marcus looked at him, his gaze steady. "You're right. You can't undo the past. Neither can I. But we can build something better. That's all that matters." Timothy nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything." As the summer wore on, the strain of their journeys began to take a toll on both families. Marcus's health remained precarious, Timothy struggled with self-doubt, and the community's divisions threatened to undo the progress that had been made. Yet, amidst the challenges, there were glimmers of hope, small moments of connection, understanding, and shared purpose that hinted at the possibility of lasting change. But a final crisis loomed, one that would force both families and the community to confront their deepest fears and most profound truths. As the community simmered with unresolved tension, a series of events pushed the Johnsons, Prestons, and their neighbors toward a breaking point. The progress made over the months was tested in ways no one anticipated, and the choices each character faced would determine the outcome of their intertwined journeys. In late August, Marcus collapsed at home. Lisa called 911, her voice shaking as she described his symptoms: dizziness, severe fatigue, and chest pain. By the time the ambulance arrived, Marcus was conscious but weak, his complexion ashen. At the hospital, the doctor's prognosis was grim. Mr. Johnson's remaining kidney is under significant strain, she explained to Lisa. If we can't stabilize his condition, he may require a transplant himself. The words hit Lisa like a sledgehammer. Marcus, the man who had given so selflessly to save another, now found himself in need of the same grace. When Timothy and Caroline heard the news, they rushed to the hospital. Timothy sat at Marcus's bedside, guilt etched into every line of his face. "This is my fault," Timothy said, his voice breaking. "If you hadn't donated to me, you wouldn't be here." Marcus shook his head weakly. "This isn't your fault, Tim. I made a choice, and I'd make it again, but now you need help," Timothy said. "And I don't know how to give it to you." Marcus managed a faint smile. "Start by being there for Lisa and the boys. That's enough for me." News of Marcus's condition reignited tensions in the community. While some rallied around the Johnsons, organizing fundraisers and offering support, others questioned whether the sacrifices Marcus had made were worth the toll on his health. An anonymous post on a neighborhood social media page reignited old arguments. Maybe Marcus should have prioritized his own family. Isn't charity supposed to begin at home? The post sparked a firestorm of responses, with neighbors taking sides. Timothy saw the comments and felt his anger boil over. That evening, he called a meeting at the community center. The meeting was packed, the room buzzing with tension. Timothy stood at the front, his face pale but determined. Caroline sat in the front row, her expression supportive but anxious. Lisa sat a few seats away, her arms crossed, visibly skeptical of the outcome. "This stops now," Timothy began, his voice firm. "We've spent months talking about change, about unity, but the second things get hard, we're back to pointing fingers. That's not who we are. Or at least, it's not who we should be," a neighbor interrupted. "It's easy for you to say that. You got a second chance. Marcus might not." The words hung in the air, cutting through the room like a knife. Timothy nodded. "You're right. Marcus gave me a second chance, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor that. But we all have a responsibility here. If we let his sacrifice divide us, then we've learned nothing." Lisa stood, her voice sharp. "And what happens to Marcus now? Are we supposed to sit back and hope someone else steps up to save him?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. Finally, a voice from the back spoke up. "No," said an older woman, stepping forward. "We don't sit back. We come together. For Marcus, for his family, and for each other." One by one, neighbors began to voice their support, committing to help in whatever ways they could. Back at the Preston household, Richard wrestled with a choice of his own. For months, he had been quietly considering becoming an organ donor, but fear and doubt had held him back. Now, with Marcus's life hanging in the balance, he knew he couldn't delay any longer. Late one night, he sat at the kitchen table with Eleanor. "I need to do this," Richard said, his voice steady. "For Marcus, for Timothy, for all the people I've let down." Eleanor reached across the table, taking his hand. "I'm proud of you," she said, "but are you sure you're ready?" "No," Richard admitted, "but it's the right thing to do. And it's about time I started doing that." As Marcus's condition worsened, the community's efforts to find a donor intensified. Social media campaigns, blood drives, and testing events were held, with hundreds of people volunteering to see if they were a match. In the midst of the chaos, Richard quietly submitted to testing. When the results came back, he was stunned to learn that he was a compatible match. Standing in his driveway, Richard watched Marcus's house across the street. The faint glow of a porch light illuminated the scene, casting long shadows on the pavement. Richard took a deep breath, his mind made up. The next morning, Richard arrived at the hospital, asking to speak with Marcus. When he entered the room, Lisa looked up in surprise. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone guarded. "I'm here to help," Richard said simply. Marcus opened his eyes, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Help how?" Richard stepped closer, his voice steady. "I got tested. I'm a match. If you'll let me, I'd like to donate." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed his words. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Why?" he asked. "Because I owe you that much," Richard said. "And because it's the right thing to do." The revelation of Richard Preston as a willing donor sent shockwaves through both families and the community. While some viewed it as a genuine act of redemption, others questioned his motives, and even Richard himself wrestled with doubts. The tension built as the decision to move forward with the transplant approached. After Richard's announcement, Marcus requested a private moment with him in the hospital room. The atmosphere was heavy, each man carrying the weight of their shared history. "You don't have to do this, Richard," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. "I never expected anything from you, and I'm not sure I can accept this." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You're right. You don't owe me anything. But this isn't about me trying to pay a debt. It's about trying to be the man I should have been all along." Marcus studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Do you really believe this will fix things?" Richard shook his head. "No, I know it won't, but it's a start. And I can't keep living with the kind of regret I feel every time I look at you, knowing what I've done or didn't do." The room fell silent, the air thick with unresolved emotions. Finally, Marcus nodded. "If you're doing this for the right reasons, then okay, let's do it." When Lisa heard the news, her first reaction was disbelief. "Richard Preston, are you serious?" she asked Marcus, her tone incredulous. "He's serious," Marcus replied, "and I think he's trying to make things right." Lisa crossed her arms, skepticism etched into her face. "After everything he's done, you really think this is about making things right? Or is it about easing his own guilt?" Marcus sighed. "Maybe it's both. But at the end of the day, if it saves my life, does it matter?" Lisa hesitated, her resolve softening. "I just don't want to see you get hurt again, Marcus." "Not by him, I know," Marcus said. "But this isn't just about him or me. It's about all of us finding a way forward." Meanwhile, Timothy struggled with his own feelings about his father's decision. Though he admired Richard's courage, he couldn't ignore the years of damage his father had caused. "Do you think he's really changed?" Timothy asked Caroline one evening. "I think he's trying," Caroline replied. "And that's more than I ever thought I'd see from him. Maybe this is his way of proving he's serious." As word spread about Richard's decision, the community once again mobilized, this time in support of both families. A local church organized a prayer vigil, drawing neighbors from all walks of life who came together to offer support and solidarity. During the vigil, Lisa and Caroline stood side by side, their differences momentarily set aside. "I still don't trust him," Lisa admitted, her voice low. "I understand," Caroline replied, "but I hope you'll give him a chance. We're all trying to be better, Lisa. It's the only way any of this works." Lisa nodded, her expression softening. "I'll try." For Marcus, the night before the surgery, Richard sat alone in the hospital chapel, his hands clasped tightly in prayer. The quiet hum of the space was broken only by the sound of the door opening. He turned to see Eleanor standing there, her face filled with concern. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, sitting beside him. "No," Richard admitted, "but I'm going to do it anyway." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. And no matter what happens, I'm proud of you." In his hospital room, Marcus shared a tender moment with his family. Lisa sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. while their sons hovered nearby. "You're going to be okay," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "We're not losing you, Marcus. Not now, not ever." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'll do my best to stick around." The following morning, the hospital was a flurry of activity as the transplant team prepared for the dual surgeries. Marcus and Richard were wheeled into adjoining operating rooms. Their families gathered in the waiting area, tense and silent. Timothy paced back and forth, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Caroline sat with Lisa, her hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Eleanor and the Johnson boys huddled together, their expressions a mix of hope and fear. Hours passed, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, a surgeon emerged, his expression calm but serious. "The surgeries went well," he said. "Both patients are stable, but the next 24 hours will be critical. We'll be monitoring them closely." The room erupted in a mixture of tears, hugs, and prayers as the families processed the news. When Marcus woke up later that evening, he was met with Lisa's tearful smile. "You made it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Of course I did," Marcus replied weakly, a hint of humor in his voice. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." In another room, Richard opened his eyes to find Timothy sitting by his side. "Dad," Timothy said softly, his voice trembling. "You did it. You saved him." Richard managed a faint smile. "I just hope it's enough." The days following the surgery marked the emotional high point of the story. As Marcus and Richard recovered, both families were forced to confront the deeper truths of their journey, finally bringing years of pain, resentment, and guilt to a head. On a snowy Christmas Eve, a gathering at the church became the setting for revelations, reconciliations, and new beginnings. Marcus, still weak but improving, requested to see Richard as soon as they were both well enough. When the nurses arranged for them to meet in a shared recovery room, the air was thick with emotion. Richard was wheeled in, his face pale, but his eyes resolute. Marcus spoke first. "I never thought we'd end up here, of all places." Richard chuckled weakly. "Life has a funny way of surprising us." The two men sat in silence for a moment before Marcus continued. "Why did you really do it, Richard? Was it guilt? Redemption? Something else?" Richard looked down at his hands, his voice soft but steady. "It started as guilt. I won't lie about that. But somewhere along the way, I realized it wasn't just about what I owed you. It was about what I owed myself. I didn't want to leave this world without making things right, at least in some small way." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, you've done something bigger than small." "Thank you." Richard's eyes glistened with tears. "No, Marcus. Thank you for being better than me, for showing me what grace really looks like." On Christmas Eve, the Prestons and Johnsons gathered at the church for a special service dedicated to hope and reconciliation. The pews were filled with neighbors who had followed the journey of these two families, their own hearts transformed by the story of sacrifice and forgiveness. Lisa and Caroline sat together, their children laughing quietly beside them. Timothy and Marcus exchanged knowing smiles from across the aisle, their bond now one of mutual respect and gratitude. Even Richard, sitting next to Eleanor, seemed lighter, as though the weight of decades of regret had finally lifted. The pastor began his sermon with a nod to the families. "Tonight, we celebrate the true meaning of Christmas: love, sacrifice, and the courage to heal. These families have shown us that even the deepest divides can be bridged when we choose compassion over fear." As the congregation sang Silent Night, the room was illuminated by candlelight, a symbol of the hope that had blossomed from pain. After the service, Marcus and Richard stepped outside together, the crisp night air filling their lungs. Snow fell softly around them, blanketing the world in a serene white. "I wanted to give you something," Marcus said, pulling a small envelope from his coat pocket. He handed it to Richard, who opened it cautiously. Inside was a simple note: "Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about freeing ourselves to build a better future. I forgive you." "Marcus." Richard stared at the note, his hands trembling. Tears streamed down his face as he looked up at Marcus. "I don't deserve this." "No," Marcus said gently. "But that's not the point." Later that evening, Timothy stood to address the gathering at the Johnsons' home, where the families had come together to celebrate Christmas. "I've been given more than one second chance," Timothy began, his voice steady but emotional. "First by Marcus, and now by my father. I want to honor those chances by making a promise, to live a life that reflects the kindness and grace I've been shown." He turned to Marcus. "You didn't just save my life, Marcus. You changed it. And I hope I can spend the rest of my days proving that your sacrifice wasn't in vain." The room erupted in applause and cheers, the warmth of the moment melting away, the last remnants of tension between the families. As the night wore on, the Johnsons and Prestons shared laughter, stories, and plans for the future. The community, inspired by their journey, had started its own initiatives to address inequities and build bridges between neighbors. Marcus's health remained fragile, but he faced the future with optimism, surrounded by the love and support of his family and friends. Richard, too, found a renewed purpose, dedicating himself to righting the wrongs he had once ignored. The story of their reconciliation became a beacon of hope, reminding everyone that even the most broken relationships could be mended with courage, humility, and love. As midnight approached, Marcus stepped outside to find Timothy standing alone under the stars. "Beautiful night," Marcus said, joining him. Timothy nodded. "It is. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like it matches what's in here." He tapped his chest, smiling softly. Marcus grinned. "That's what this season is all about." Timothy looked at Marcus, his expression earnest. "Merry Christmas, Marcus. And thank you for everything." "Merry Christmas, Tim," Marcus replied. "Let's make it a good one." As the snow continued to fall, the two men stood side by side, their friendship a testament to the power of forgiveness, sacrifice, and the enduring hope of a brighter tomorrow. Final call to action. If this story moved you, let it inspire your own acts of kindness and courage. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of transformation and hope, and don't forget to share this with someone who might need a reminder that change is always possible. Stay tuned for our next video, and remember, it's never too late to build bridges and light the way for others.